He described it as starting from black scratch, and by that he meant instead of starting from square one, starting from square zero.
When you think about Carl, you automatically think fighter, and not just in the ring, but he was a fighter. I'll change things. I'll change things.
I mean, this is what is so incredible about his story. He started from having no parents and being kicked out of the only orphanage that would take him to bronze statue in Gonzaga Law School that says he made a difference.
And he was just kind of like our savior. Well, we've got a lawyer now. We've got a lawyer in Carl Maxey. Take it to Carl. Have problems, take it to Carl. He'll take care of it, you know.
He was our Martin Luther King in the Northwest. He had a great compassion for people, not just black people. He had a passion for justice. He took on these cases, went to court on his dime.
You just didn't look at anything but Carl. You just didn't. He dominated everything.
How do you go from down there to up there? What is that story? And you know it's got to be a good story, and it turns out it is an amazingly good story.
Now you try that at the National Democratic Convention and see how far you'd get.
Carl Maxey once said he wanted to be judged in life like a boxer is judged in a ring, honestly, without prejudice, and based strictly on blows landed.
And then you go ahead and explain, and I dare you to do it, that you snuck out and burned your ballot.
Maxey landed enough blows, both legal and political, for the New York Times to call him a Type A Gandhi shortly after his death in 1997 at age 73. The Times called him one of the best-known lawyers in the country, a black attorney who smashed the color barriers in his creamy white hometown of Spokane, Washington. Maxey defended a black citizen's right to get a haircut, teach in public schools, join social clubs, and buy a house in any neighborhood. He defended anti-war protesters, ran for U.S. Senate, and was nominated for the state Supreme Court. The ACLU gave him the prestigious William O. Douglas Bill of Rights Award, and 4 presidents named him state chair of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. What most don't know is that Carl Maxey started from scratch, or as he called it, black scratch.
Sometime in the fire, sometime in the fire.
Carl Maxey was born and orphaned in 1924. A more luckless childhood is hard to imagine.
He was a black child in Spokane during the Great Depression with no means of support and no family structure at all.
Spokane in the 1920s was almost an entirely white city. Of its 100,000 residents, only 700 were people of color.
We knew everybody of color at that time. Everybody knew everybody's name, looked out for everybody's kids.
Back then, Spokane had its own form of segregation. On the one hand, black residents did not have to sit at the back of buses or trolley cars. Washington State had passed a law barring the segregation of public accommodations in 1890. Nor did Spokane have segregated schools. This was not the Jim Crow of the South. But black people in Spokane were not immune from racial injustice.
We faced a different type of discrimination and racism in Spokane.
It was subtle here. You might be walking down the street or something and somebody call you the N-word.
You had housing covenants. Blacks were restricted from certain neighborhoods like the South Hill.
We went the house was sold, but then a white couple would come and the house wasn't sold.
And we knew where we could go. Like we knew that we couldn't go into certain restaurants and things like that. We knew that, so we didn't go.
Even a black-owned business, like the Harlem Club, was only open to black patrons on Sunday and Monday nights.
You could only go on those nights because the other nights, the social people in Spokane would go to that club. They wouldn't mix.
When it came to jobs, housing, clubs, hotels, and restaurants, black people had to know their place, and their place was narrowly defined.
They only could work in menial labor positions, so they were restricted socially and economically.
In employment, blacks were restricted to laboring jobs and domestic service in homes, clubs, and hotels. Professional jobs were strictly off limits. In 1930, Spokane had yet to have a single black doctor, dentist, or school teacher. Spokane certainly did not have a black lawyer. At age 5, Carl was sent to the scandal-ridden Spokane Children's Home. The place was a nightmare for any child.
He had nothing but bad memories about it.
Oh, it was horrible. The oatmeal had rat feces in it.
To the outside world, the home seemed a good-hearted, well-intentioned institution. But after dark,
The assistant superintendent enjoyed beating the kids. They would lay awake at night, then he'd walk slowly down the row of beds and he would pick out a kid and beat him with a belt. That's what it was like to live there.
and it didn't stop at beatings.
And it involved sexual abuse.
On August 15th, 1935, the facade came crashing down.
Both the superintendent and the assistant superintendent ended up going to Walla Walla on morals charges, sodomy charges.
Carl was not one of the kids sexually assaulted.
And as he said, it's a good thing they didn't like black kids.
Indeed, racial minorities were expendable. In the wake of the abuse scandal, the Homes Board met and decided to kick out 11-year-old Carl and the only other minority, Milton Burns, for no other apparent reason than the color of their skin. In the minutes, there was a motion that Carl Maxey and Milton Burns be removed from the home and that no other minority children be admitted.
After they had found the minutes of that meeting, he actually had it framed and put on the wall of his office. And when I interviewed him, he actually got it down and showed it to me and basically said, if you want to know where I come from, it comes from a background that includes this. And that's where my fire comes from. And this fueled his fire and his passion and his lifelong desire for equal treatment.
Located some 50 miles away on the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation in De Smet, Idaho, was the Sacred Heart Mission. At that time, the mission had an Indian boarding school run by Jesuit fathers. In charge was a feisty Irish-American priest, Father Cornelius Byrne.
Father Byrne heard that the county orphanage had kicked out these two little black boys because they didn't want black boys in the orphanage, and that they were in the juvenile hall. And Father Byrne, feisty champion of the underprivileged that he was, says this can't be. So he arranged with the court to get a legal guardianship, and he brought him out to De Smet.
It turned out to be a turning point in both of their lives. Father Byrne was a remarkable man, incredibly tolerant and a believer in racial justice and racial equality. And he took both of these kids under his wing and said, you guys can be something.
Carl adored him. He said he was the closest thing to a father that he ever had.
Carl always said that Father Byrne was the most influential person in his life, bar none. For the first time in Maxie's life, he was in a place that wasn't all white.
I think Carl was really well accepted amongst the Indians.
We all went to the boarding school. When we got there was Maxie. Seemed like that Maxie already was in already.
Maxie thrived.
And he started having a lot of real athletic success. The fellows that were there with him, they talk about everything changed when Carl got here. We started winning.
The Sacred Heart teams traveled to some of the toughest towns in North Idaho with ugly reputations for racism.
He was quite a football player, very fast. When you're running for touchdowns against the miners' kids in North Idaho, you know, you're going to be the subject of some hate, especially if your skin is black.
They went to Wallace, Idaho for a game. He had to stay at the home of a sheriff because of threats.
Maxie's real taste for boxing started at Sacred Heart.
His first recollection of stepping into the ring was when he was 13 years old and the boxer across from him was 33 years old. This was a pursuit for men. This was not a boy's delight anymore. So it was a real lesson for him. I remember asking him, "Did you win?" He says, "Oh yes, I won." He said, "But I looked like the loser."
Maxie learned more than how to box.
He's learning a lot about the cold, cruel world out there. I mean, you go into these tough places as the only black person there. Places where he was going to get heckled, and more than just heckled, he's going to be reviled, and people are going to want to see blood. But he also learned that there was an essential fairness, especially in boxing. It was just you and the other guy. Things were evened up real quickly. Now, yeah, you might be up against a guy 20 years older, but it was still just you and him.
Father Byrne helped Carl receive an athletic scholarship to attend Gonzaga High School, Spokane's Catholic prep school. At Gonzaga Prep, Maxie became a good student and a star athlete. He worked nights as a waiter at the Swank City Club, now known as the Spokane Club.
He said he got paid 25 cents an hour and all you could steal.
At that time, the City Club was the elite power club in town. All the movers and shakers belonged to it. You could not be a member if you were black. They had no black members, but it was one of the most significant employer of black people in Spokane. And Carl had extremely mixed feelings about it.
He remembered the lawyers and the powerful people in town would snap their fingers at him and say, "Hey boy."
That was part of the ambiance of the place. You know, you had respectful black waiters in immaculate outfits serving you.
He saw these guys who were influential and powerful and had power over his life. He wanted that kind of influence to make the community better.
It's 1941, a day of infamy. Even as Japanese diplomats were conferring with Secretary of State Hull on peace measures, Nipponese planes were swooping down on Pearl Harbor.
When Maxie graduated from high school in 1942, the world was at war. Carl enlisted in the Army Reserves and became a medic. At the time, the military was completely segregated.
There were separate facilities, separate USOs. It just really was a shock to him. When he was at Fort Lewis, he felt like the Italian and German POWs they had there, they were treated better than he was sometimes, he and the other black soldiers.
Most blacks were fighting for what they called a double victory, or double V.
This was a national campaign, and the Pittsburgh Courier promoted a double V, victory overseas against Nazi Germany, and victory on the home front against racism and Jim Crow. And African Americans who fought during World War II, they hoped that, you know, since we were fighting for victory overseas and to spread democracy, that this democracy would spread here, and that blacks and their rights in the United States would be protected as well. But some blacks returning from the war in Spokane, people like Carl Maxie, realized that this was only a dream.
He came back to Spokane, and he was in uniform, and he gets off the bus at the Spokane bus depot and walks in to get a hot dog in the lunch stand, and they wouldn't serve him. All of these things added up to awakening in him a desire to do something about this.
At age 21, Maxcy began to think about a profession where he could make a difference: the law. Carl entered the University of Oregon on a track scholarship and threw himself into social causes and liberal politics. He soon met his future wife, Ninan King.
She was white, she was beautiful, she was brilliant, and they really hit it off, and they became a couple. But that wasn't easy, even on the Oregon campus at the time. She got in a lot of trouble for it. I mean, they actually threatened to kick her out of Phi Beta Kappa at one point. When they'd walk through campus, people would yell things at them, the same old words. And it wasn't easy.
In the fall of 1947, Carl enrolled at Gonzaga Law School. Ninan followed, and they wed in Spokane.
Law school was a night class, and so most of us had jobs during the day, and we would work in the wee hours of the night studying.
While a struggling law student, Carl was offered a boxing scholarship with the help of Coach Joey August.
Joey was about 5'3" maybe, I don't know, and he was an absolute giant in this town in terms of sports. I think Joey and Carl were a great fit. He was a magnificent fighter. He had speed, he had great power, timing, he had a grace in the ring.
Guys who were real boxing aficionados would get misty-eyed when they would talk about how he fought.
In most of the bouts, frankly, he said his biggest challenge was to not pummel the guy into the ground.
Maxcy became a local celebrity. His teammates called him King Carl.
He was undefeated throughout his entire college career. He never lost a collegiate boxing match.
In 1950, Maxcy's collegiate record was 26-0, but he still had one more tournament to face: the National Collegiate Boxing Championship in State College, Pennsylvania.
They're going up against really big schools: Ohio State, Penn State, these caliber of schools, Michigan.
Nobody thought Gonzaga could win. Carl faced a former Olympic boxer from Michigan State, who was also undefeated through his college career. In the first two rounds, both fought to a virtual draw.
The New York Times was there, and they said that it was one of the most exciting college bouts they'd ever seen.
In the end, King Carl won by 1 point, and Gonzaga won its first ever NCAA boxing championship.
It's hard to overestimate how important this was to Spokane. We hadn't had any big sports victories of any on any kind of a national scale, nothing at all like this.
The greeting at the airport was over the top. I mean, there was 1,000 people there, they say, and that waited until the plane shut down its engines and then stormed the plane.
The boxers came off the plane, they hoisted them on their shoulders, they carried them off the tarmac on their shoulders, made speeches, and then the next day they had a ceremony at Gonzaga where the president of the college honored them, and so it was a big deal. It was a really, really big deal.
Shortly afterwards, Carl would quit boxing and concentrate on finishing law school. His future bouts would be held in the courtroom.
Well, I look out on the water, and coming through the storm, there he was. There he was. There he was. There he was. Oh,
in 1951, Carl Maxcy became the first African American to pass the state bar exam in Eastern Washington. Spokane still did not have a black doctor, dentist, or teacher. but it now had a black attorney.
Like any young lawyer, he had to basically hustle for work.
In those days, attorneys could not advertise. You couldn't even put a sign that said attorney.
You know, in those days, you couldn't have 2 lines in the Yellow Pages. And now, you know, you can buy a square, you can buy a whole page, you know. So, what you do is you run for office.
Maxey ran for state representative, primarily for free advertising. He lost that race, but at age 28, Karl Maxey was elected the NAACP president of the Spokane chapter. Karl promised change through legal action. Maxey took on the State Liquor Control Board. They had refused to issue a liquor license to a black-owned tavern because it served both blacks and whites.
Mr. Maxey challenged the Washington State Liquor Control Board with a lawsuit, and he won, and the license was given back to this black-owned business.
The African American community had scored its first major civil rights victory. Maxey opened a downtown office with Victor Felice, a law school buddy. He handled mostly divorce and small-time criminal cases.
He could get enough of these paying cases to take on the cases that he really wanted to do, which were the civil rights cases, which he immediately started handling, but usually pro bono, for free.
One of the first cases Maxey took on was Eugene Breckenridge.
I walked down the street some 2 months after I had graduated and saw a black man washing windows, and I knew he was a cadet teacher and had been voted the outstanding student teacher of his class. And I said, "Why aren't you in the public school system here in Spokane?" He said, "They won't hire me because I'm black." I filed a lawsuit against the school system that afternoon and opened the door for him. He later became the president of the WEA.
The Breckenridge case broke the color bar for teachers in the school district. And Karl kept going, constantly challenging restaurants, businesses, social clubs, and nightclubs that were off limits to African Americans.
There were a lot of things in Spokane as far as rights of people, say civil rights and representing minorities. Karl kicked the door down when it came to things like that.
One of his early wins was defending a young man who wanted to get a haircut, a black man, and the man would not cut his hair because he was black. Karl took that on, and it was a front page item, made big news, and thank goodness he was there. I mean, that's the sort of thing that deserves litigation.
If you're a black customer in Spokane and you go to a lunch counter and you sit there and sit there and sit there and they won't serve you, you finally just have to get up and leave. You didn't really necessarily have a lawyer to go to. Now they would come to Karl Maxey and he would say, "Yeah, I'll take that case."
During one of the trials, it was suggested they all take a field trip to the actual restaurant.
The judge asked the lawyers if they would be willing to go along with this field trip, and Maxey said something sarcastic like, "Yeah, but they won't let me in." And the judge had to reprimand him for that.
He had that temper, so do a lot of people. It's pretty hard to be a boxer, and not get tipped in the nose. I mean, he didn't like to see little people be pushed around, and he didn't like people to say things that implicated race or prejudice. And he'd tell you about it.
Maxey gained a reputation as a force to be reckoned with.
Karl was a boat rocker, an agitator, a troublemaker, pushing for change and justice and all of those things that seemed so radical. He was bold, and he was not apologetic in the least. He knew what he stood for, and he fought for it.
He was considered a force, a major force, and of course that built up as the cases mounted, and there became an aura around him.
If he got into an adversarial mode, then there was really no stepping back from that. You were going to go to war with Karl, and he wasn't someone that you wanted to go to war with. And if the claim had merit, the wise person would probably find a way to get it settled.
There was a real divide between those who thought Karl Maxey was a hero and those who thought he was just a troublemaker who was threatening the status quo.
That are a direct result of that type of usurpation of power.
In the 1956 gubernatorial campaign, Maxcy helped get the minority vote out for Democrat Albert Rossellini. After Rossellini won, he visited Spokane to celebrate. An up-and-coming young black entertainer named Sammy Davis Jr. was performing at the Greek American Club, and Rossellini and his entourage decided to watch the show.
They got to the door and they looked at Maxcy and said, you can't come in, you're not admitted. It was one of those clubs that had a Caucasian-only rule. It would be specific in the membership bylaws, Caucasians only.
The entire group, including the governor, said they would not stay unless Maxcy stayed. The owners told them all to leave. Opening up the city's social clubs became one of Maxcy's crusades over the next 10 years, and he succeeded.
And he took on the social clubs with a really unique and kind of brilliant legal strategy, really, which is if you're a private social club and you want to choose who your members are, you have a perfect right to do that. I don't argue that. You should be allowed to have anybody in your club you want, and you can exclude anybody you want. But if you are also asking for a public right, and in this case, a liquor license is a public right, then you can't do that. Now, a liquor license was absolutely crucial to their operation. You couldn't have a social club without one. This was a very smart and clever way to basically force social clubs to finally get these restrictive clauses out of their membership bylaws.
Fill me up and I feel fine.
Maxcy's law practice grew. Maxcy joined into partnership with Leo Fredrickson and Robert Bell.
But it was a very active practice, and his practice in particular, he had, lots of cases. He had several secretaries. I always wonder how he was able to keep all those irons in the fire and maintain his sanity, as it were.
They donated 20% of their time pro bono.
That was 20% of a lot. So got him in trouble sometimes, but he never wavered from that, and I'm not sure that he even kept it to just 20%.
Carl had a deep passion for the people who were downtrodden, for the disenfranchised, for the hopeless.
A lot of the people that he represented didn't have funds. Because a lot of the attorneys nowadays says, yeah, I'll take your case. What's in the bank account? He wasn't like that.
As the work grew, so did his family. Maxcy and Nina now had 2 sons, Bill and Bevan.
The name that he called me, my nickname, was Bones, because I was so skinny. So I can always remember him coming home and saying, "Hey, Bones," and so like I said, when he came through the door, he always had a lot of energy, which made me feel special.
It was getting murderous in the Deep South.
In 1964, civil rights organizations started a massive voter registration drive in the state of Mississippi. It was called Freedom Summer.
Students and activists converged on Mississippi to do voter registration and community organizing, and it was the most dangerous of times.
At that time, blacks in the South were denied their right to register to vote.
So they decided that they were going to stage a lot of mass protests and mass sit-ins, and one thing they needed is a lot of legal representation.
Maxcy and 2 other lawyers from Spokane volunteered for the job.
Now, this was very dangerous. Just a few weeks before they left was when the 3 civil rights workers disappeared and were eventually found murdered. Carl told his friends that he was essentially petrified the entire time he was down there.
But that's what they just spent all their time doing, trying to get people out of jail and make sure that they weren't killed in custody. It was just sheer terror.
Maxcy became one of the lawyers who defended over 100 activists arrested for picketing the courthouse in Greenwood, Mississippi, after the clerk refused to register black voters. Angry Ku Klux Klan members surrounded the courthouse to intimidate the defendants.
He was appalled at what he saw in Mississippi. He called it the tail end of America. He said that justice was completely absent.
Maxcy and the other lawyers succeeded in moving the cases to federal court, where the charges were dropped. The Freedom Summer resulted in 1,000 arrests, 80 beatings, 35 churches burned, and 6 murders.
Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting?
In the 60s, Maxcy became increasingly concerned not only with civil rights, but with the Vietnam War.
Again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
He started defending Vietnam War protesters, draft dodgers, and conscientious objectors.
Carl Maxcy was the only attorney in Spokane that would take anti-war conscientious objector cases because none of them wanted to be identified with being against that very popular at that time war.
He was vehemently opposed to the Vietnam War, and he felt that the war was morally wrong in the first place, and also that the burden of it was being carried by black soldiers.
My friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
Patrick Stiley remembers going to work for Carl.
I had a ponytail down damn near to my belt and back. And I said, but I'm not cutting my hair. And he said, look at me. I'm black. I'm the only black lawyer in this town. You think I'm going to require you to cut your hair? Give me a break. And we hit it off immediately.
Maxcy politically began to fight against the war. In the 1968 presidential race, Maxcy supported anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy and became his spokesman at the state Democratic Convention.
The challenge of the Washington state delegation, one of 4 today, was typical both of the challenges and the pro-McCarthy position, which claims its supporters were excluded by unfair devices of one sort or another.
In 1970, Maxcy took on Washington's longtime Democratic Senator, Henry Scoop Jackson. Incensed at Jackson's support of the Vietnam War, Maxcy filed against him for the Democratic nomination.
Oh, he never expected to win. No. It was primarily an anti-war campaign.
For every purpose under heaven. A time to gain, a time to lose, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for peace. I swear it's not too late.
Carl Maxcy for U.S. Senate.
He happened to be in a state where the most powerful Democratic senator, Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, was a hawk, a very pro-war, pro-Vietnam War hawk who had, in some ways, was an architect of our involvement in the Vietnam War. At least that's what Maxcy thought.
Henry Jackson had become so identified with the war. You know, they call him the senator from Boeing.
The odds of anyone beating Scoop Jackson were practically nil.
Running against Scoop Jackson was like trying to climb Mount Rainier barefoot.
But Maxcy was one of the leading civil rights and anti-war figures in the state, and he didn't pull any punches.
He called him a little senator with a Napoleonic complex. He just went after him as hard as he could.
To the complete shock of the Democratic establishment, Maxcy was endorsed at the King County Democratic Convention, the largest county in the state.
Maxcy and the anti-war delegates basically took over that convention, and they maneuvered their way into getting Maxcy the endorsement of the King County Democratic Convention for Senate over Scoop Jackson.
Even with that victory, Scoop Jackson won the primary. Maxcy expected 10% of the vote, but got 13.
So he considered it a victory. I think one of his lines was, "Even a black cat can look at a king."
It was a sizable statement that these times are changing.
The campaign led to the most controversial and heavily publicized case of his career, the trial of the Seattle Seven. They were members of an anti-war group called the Seattle Liberation Front, which in 1970 organized an anti-war demonstration in front of Seattle's federal courthouse.
It was a giant war protest. It was on a day when there were war protests all over the country.
When the police intervened, the protest turned violent.
Things got out of hand. Tear gas was lobbed. Some people broke windows at the federal courthouse. They had to be pushed back by police. There were skirmishes between police and protesters.
The 7 defendants, including at least one former member of the Weathermen, were charged with conspiracy to riot and destroy public property. Carl Maxcy was brought in as one of the defense team's lawyers.
Carl was great to us as the defendants. I mean, he was more than just a lawyer. He acted as a father, uncle, brother, advisor. We were all very young. We were a little bit wild. We thought we were being persecuted by the federal government, which we were. And Carl continually tried to convince us during the trial that this case was winnable on the facts.
The trial began in Tacoma in November 1970 under U.S. District Court Judge George Bolt. About 2 weeks into the trial, all order broke down.
They wanted the stage. They really wanted the stage.
Because some of our members were louder than others and younger, two of them were 19, I almost feel like we played into the judge's hands and the prosecutor's hands because their case was falling apart. And as it fell apart, we got louder and more obnoxious, and we were in contempt of court. I mean, there's no question about that. We were in contempt of court.
Somehow threw this Nazi flag, and then all hell broke loose. Carl, he went up and sat down in the witness chair, while all around was madness.
Bolt, in his contempt certificate, praised Maxcy for doing what he could to prevent or restrain his clients.
A mistrial has been declared in Tacoma, Washington, in the case of 7 young left-wing radicals charged with conspiring to damage federal buildings in Seattle in a demonstration last February. Today, the 6 defendants present refused to enter the courtroom because the number of spectators was limited. Federal Judge George Bolt said their act probably biased the jury, and he stopped the trial. He also cited the 6 for contempt.
Maxcy's reputation increasingly made him the lawyer of choice, not just in political cases, but the nastiest cases of all, divorce cases. He had received death threats on more than one occasion.
There was concern for his family's well-being at times. He got death threats. They were not uncommon. He built a shelter in his backyard,
Because I remember as a young kid, you know, answering the phone, and you know, every once in a while someone would start, you know, yelling the N-word and calling names and all that, you know.
In 1977, a couple walked out of Maxey's office after a divorce settlement, stood in the corridor, and without warning, the husband pulled out his gun and shot his wife twice in the head and killed himself. Maxey's own marriage ended in divorce in the early 1970s. 4 years later, he married Lou Douglas.
Lou and Carl were inseparable. I think they probably finished each other's sentences. I think they were each other's best friends.
Maxey continued his political activism throughout the 1970s. He advocated open meeting laws for local government, and he advocated for tougher environmental standards and cleanup.
He filed that lawsuit against the city for dumping untreated sewage into the Spokane River. He brought suit against the city council for holding discussions in secret and then casting their votes in public. So he was about more than civil rights.
Maxey's office was hectic to say the least. His 1 o'clock appointments were notorious.
An appointment with Carl was at 1 o'clock. It was first come, first serve. And people lined up. I used to always tease him that I was going to get him one of those red ticket holders with numbers on them and start saying, now serving number. But that's what people did. They wanted to see him enough that they would sit there all afternoon. And he would see them. He would see all of them.
When he talked about the word justice, he meant more than the normal concept of, well, there's going to be a winner or a loser and that's going to be fair. He was the epitome of equity and making sure someone had the right to be heard and had access to the system.
We were having some really serious problems in City Hall with race relations. And in fact, at that time, Chief Mangan had announced that gangs were taking over Spokane and that it was young African-American boys that were causing the problems. Of course, everybody just had a fit because it was labeling, and some young African-American boy had been killed, and so it was a very, very serious time. And I remember meeting with Carl in my office and the African-American ministers coming in to the conference room and meeting with the city manager and Chief Mangan and saying, you know, this is not right and what are we going to do?
You want the real wrong answer, just keep them in the juvenile system and in the criminal justice system, and they'll really get an education in crime.
He held our feet to the fire. I think I can say that. That's why I think I was so attracted to Carl and his principles. I feel that he led this community absolutely into a new age, because people knew no matter what happened, if it was wrong, he was going to be there.
Maxey was one of the original 14 founders of the Loren Miller Bar Association for African American lawyers.
As a young lawyer and having a chance to spend quality time with someone I saw as the Black Lion King of civil rights, that I wanted to learn from Carl. I wanted to learn where he got his strength, where he got his courage, where he got his motivation from. And you could always count on Carl to be the lightning rod and the tempest in the teapot to try and make something happen.
I think he inspired me, he inspired others to say that, you know, there's nothing you can't do. We held a common kind of ground of knowing what it's like to run statewide, to run for office in places where you're not necessarily perceived as the person to be there or to even succeed. So I felt he was a champion.
And if you walk downtown Spokane with Carl Maxey, it was like walking around with a celebrity, because people from all walks of life would come up. Everybody knew Carl, had something friendly to say, and when Carl walked into a courtroom, they knew Carl Maxey had arrived.
Spokane, Washington, an unusual murder-for-hire trial began today. The defendant is a 61-year-old woman. Her alleged victims, a judge and a prosecutor. The alleged motive, getting even for what they did to her son.
In 1981, Maxey took on yet another sensational trial, the murder-for-hire case of Ruth Coe.
They tell us that the Southville rapist is caught. Throw away your mace, throw away your guns. You save girls. Ha! My son didn't do it.
Spokane had made national news earlier that year when Ruth's son, Kevin Coe, was arrested and convicted of being the notorious South Hill rapist, suspected of more than 40 sexual assaults. After the conviction, his mother was caught on tape telling an undercover officer, posing as a hitman, that she wanted the judge and prosecutor killed.
In that recording, when they asked her what she wanted to have done, she said, "I want the judge killed on his way to church with his family in the car, and I want Don Brockett made into an addle-pated vegetable so that he will have to live as a person in diapers for the rest of his life." It wasn't real to me. I'd been through several different threats before that, until I went over to thank the hitman undercover detective, and then I thought, wow, this could really have happened.
Maxey was hired to defend Ruth Coe.
And in a way, it seems strange that this lion of civil rights, you know, would defend a well-to-do white woman, the mother of a sexual psychopath, but Carl took the case.
He represented murderers, rapists, Hell's Angels, and I asked him one time, I said, "How do you do that and live with yourself?" And he told me, he said, "Marcia," he said, "it's not my job to decide if they're innocent or guilty. That's for the judge and the jury. And it's only my job to give them the best defense I can give them."
Ruth Coe was found guilty, but Maxey persuaded the judge to be lenient in his sentence.
Anytime you can represent somebody who's tried to have a judge killed and a prosecutor put in diapers, and you can get them 90 days of school release time so that all they do is check out of jail in the morning, go sit out at Spokane Falls Community College for the whole day drinking coffee, and then going and checking yourself back into jail overnight, you're doing a great job. I was outraged.
It was like there were lions walking the halls of the courthouse, you know, these great, larger-than-life personalities. In court, they would be impassioned and just go at it hammer and tongs with each other. And then out in the hall afterwards, you know, during breaks, it would be almost, you get to feel that they were at a reunion of their class from law school. They were friends, even though they seemed like mortal enemies in court. They respected each other, and Carl had that about him.
But Carl was a big guy. Carl was a big guy. I mean, he just was tall and you just looked at him and you say, "Oh, you know, he's here." He had that impression on you, you know.
He was aggressive in the court. He clearly got his position and his points across with the court. When he walked in, the judges knew he was a good trial lawyer, he was a litigator, and if Carl got a chance to get to a jury, Carl was going to make headway with that case.
The one experience that I can remember that was somewhat humorous, I didn't consider it humorous at the time, was I had given my opening argument at the end of the case, and Carl stood up and basically said to the jury, now you've heard the argument of the prosecutor saying that my client is guilty of this crime, and I'd like to sing a song for you. And he started singing Blowing in the Wind. And that, of course, told the jury that my argument was something that was blowing on the wind, that it wasn't worth listening to.
Maxcy had plenty of enemies. Some lawyers complained of an overdramatic style. Some said he was a publicity seeker. Some complained that he played to jurors' emotions and made everything about race.
I think, like any fighter, when you get hit, your first instinct is to hit back hard. And I think he did that sometimes. He'd been kicked in the teeth so much with racism during his life, I think he was not necessarily above using the racial divide as a cudgel sometimes.
Carl would see opposing counsel and he'd start pleading his case or pitching his case before the judge walked out and making feel opposing counsel uncomfortable. And it was almost like using his boxing skills to get in your opponent's head before the match actually started.
Carl could change a decision by just walking in a room. One year, the school board was considering closing Lincoln Elementary School, one of the only diverse grade schools in Spokane. The PTA hired Carl Maxcy.
So we had $100 in the treasury. So we went to Carl's office and asked him to represent us. The night of the school board meeting, we were all sitting there, all these parents. We were waiting, you know. Then the school board kind of all but said, yeah, we're going to close it, you know. But Carl wasn't there. And we were sitting there and we were saying, where's Carl? Where's Carl? You know, whispering that, you know. So then the door opened. Like I told you, Carl was just bigger than life. And he came in the door and he went over and sat with the parents. And the school board members looked at each other. And then one of them said, we've come to the decision that we won't close the Lincoln School this year. They didn't want to tackle Carl. Carl had a reputation. They did not want to tackle him. And he didn't even take our $100.
There's hope abound in America if you get out and pay the price for it. I don't buy this Republican tittle-tattle that we're in a kinder, gentler society. As a matter of fact, it's meaner and more abrasive than it was when I was a kid. But you have to learn and get prepared and aid in changing the country. Then it will become, perhaps, a more gentle environment and nation.
Tragically, on July 17, 1997, Carl Maxcy took his own life in his home with a single gunshot to his head.
We were just absolutely shocked.
Boy, the tears didn't stop for a long time.
Nobody will ever know the reason for his suicide. He left no note, and there was no autopsy. However, his oldest friend, Milton Burns, said he was just wore out. He had done so many things for so many people that it finally got to him.
Carl Maxcy's obituary in the New York Times was half a page. I mean, presidents don't get a half a page.
The Spokesman Review's headline read, "Spokane loses a champion."
This guy would have been a giant anywhere. He had a vision and he had a voice, and those weren't going to be denied.
Think about civil rights and causes and somebody seeking justice. His name's always going to be in the forefront of those battles.
He was missed the day he died. There are very few people that come forth and are really willing to put themselves on the line and to prick the consciences of those around you as to what's right and wrong.
And that's what Carl Maxcy to me was about, taking the challenges and making life better for the least of these.
When he walked that court with that big white mane of hair, you clearly knew that you had a champion in your corner, win or lose.
You may order your own copy of this program by calling 1-800-735-2377 or by visiting our secure website at ksbs.org.